talking to people and working with organizations, it's very clear to me that we're in a phase of experimenting, and particularly when it comes to influencer relations. And the way that we interact with each other, the way that we perceive brands, the way we communicate and find people is all changing a lot at the moment. So what I was going to talk about a little bit today is how we have to think very differently about three core areas. First of all, about influencers, who they are, how do we find them, and secondly, the story that we tell them, because the art of storytelling is still the most central part of influence relations, and that is causing big headaches at the moment, I would say. And then thirdly, our mindset, our attitude towards outcome. The PR industry has, for a long time, and I think still does, work on a very, very short-term basis. We do something today, we issue a pitch, or we set up a meeting with someone today, and we expect coverage or something to appear in the next week at least, or in the next month. Now, as I will talk about a little bit in how influencer relations is changing much more towards a long-term game. So we need to be more comfortable with accepting that things maybe just doesn't happen only on a short-term basis. So we're at this kind of phase where everyone is experimenting with things, and this is what I've seen, from my past few months of just talking and debating about this, is that everyone is trying to find different things, and that's why it's particularly important that we talk about these kind of things today. So the first thing is, so if I ask, what is an influencer? Yeah. If I ask if you think influencers are social influencers, who thinks that? Raise your hand. Social people, right? Okay. What about media? Traditional media? Who thinks? Right. What about politicians? Okay. Hesitant, that one. What about academics? What about all of them? Okay, right? So that's where we're getting at. And it's interesting because depending on who you ask around the world, everyone will give you a different interpretation of what an influencer is. A lot of people associated with academics, a lot of people associated with social bloggers, etc. But we're getting to the point now that we have to view them all as influencers, because we need to have ambassadors in every single part of the world, really. So whereas we were used to take a story and, in a traditional sense, pitch that to media and increasingly to bloggers, why not take that story and call up some influential academics or think tanks or industry groups and say, hey, this is happening today. Or we have this person in town today. Do you want to meet them? Right? To have that, to start thinking about influencers as a broader ecosystem. How do you find them? Well, there are very smart social tools out there to do that. We've talked about before how people find them over the web. Now, there's various different ways of finding them, but the point is that we need to start thinking. Again, it's one of these things where we need to start thinking differently, because a lot of people that you talk to, and I think that's still the case in a lot of organizations, is that various parts of influence relations, whether it's analyst relations or public affairs or social, is done in a kind of a fragmented way. You have the people doing the media relations in one part, you have analyst relations, which is maybe a little bit detached over there, and then you have the social machine going on a daily basis, on a real-time basis. Now, I think we need to start bringing all of these things together in a more integrated way as a kind of a more clever ecosystem. So that's one thing, to start thinking differently about that. And I'll give you a great example of why. One organization that we worked with was a very small technology firm in Sweden called NetClean, who had a very important technology. It was to protect children against child sexual abuse. So a very sensitive debate. We started to work with them, and for obvious reasons, it was hard to get customers to come out and say that they use this technology in the workplace. So there were some challenges around how we did PR for this firm. So we got some, because of the innovation that they did and because of the importance of what they did, we managed to get some great media coverage in the beginning, but because the debate was relatively sporadic, at one point, we heard a lot about it, and then it wasn't something that was kind of talked about on a daily basis a couple of years ago when we started working with it. So there were times when we really couldn't have any, we couldn't really do anything. So of course, then you get the client, calling on the phone. So what you've done this month, and there's only a certain amount of time that works. So we realized, look, we have to look beyond just media to engage, because we saw that it was an increasingly important issue for society. So we started to engage with think tanks, started to set up meetings with think tanks, and as part of that, then become part of a whole different type of debate. Reports on children in society, etc. Meanwhile, we were doing media relations. And I think is a good example of how sometimes you can't just be dependent on one set of influences, and you have to start looking beyond maybe what was just your core first group. And of course, if you look at the whole ecosystem that we're talking about, of academics, analysts, politicians, industry groups, etc., not every organization are going to have a story or a debate that is of relevance to all of those. But once you start thinking differently, I can guarantee you that you're going to find at least one or two audiences that you maybe haven't thought about before. So that's the kind of the ecosystem that we think we need to start thinking more about. And that kind of brings me back to the importance of the story. I do a lot of media training as well. And one of the hardest questions for companies to answer is not how many people are you going to sack this year, or do you think you're overpaid, or all these slightly uncomfortable questions. Because you can learn quite quickly how to answer those questions. The hardest question to answer for anyone is, tell me something interesting about your company. Yeah? People who get that question, they will say, well, we have this product, or we're in so and so many countries, and we employ so and so many people. And say, that's not interesting. I can see that from your website. Then you ask them, what would happen if we took away your company for a year? Imagine your organization doesn't exist for a year. What would happen? And then, of course, questions start to, well, people wouldn't be able to do this or that. Then, the story is starting to kind of shape around a much broader debate. So this is the other thing where we need to start thinking very differently, is about being less self-centered. A lot of organizations still have a tendency to think primarily about what they do and why that is important, etc. But when we need to start thinking outside of those four walls to relate to a broader audience, especially if you start thinking about a broader ecosystem of people. Because what is interesting to one group might not be interesting to another group. So working on that story is very, very important. And equally important, finding the storytellers. So finding the people within the organization who have the confidence and guts and creativity to tell that story. And that's also a lot harder than you might think, in my experience anyway. But once you find those storytellers and they start telling that story to a broader set of influencers, things happen. And things happen quickly, and it's really interesting to see. So that's the second area where we need to start thinking differently. It's about the story and how we tell that story. Then the third part, as I kind of referred to a little bit earlier on, is this idea to think differently about outcome. And this goes against human people, because we are impatient as people. We don't like the unknown. I mean, that's if you say to something, I'm going to go to this tonight, I'm not quite sure what it's going to be like. The follow-up to that is not usually, I think it's going to be great. It is, not sure. People are skeptical, people are impatient, and that's part of people. And part of that is also that we expect things to happen very quickly, especially if you pay for it. And that's where quarterly reporting, for example, within companies, that hasn't helped either. We live in a very, very short-term mindset world where we expect things to happen very quickly. That works in some influencer organizations. In some, we have to have a real-time mentality today. Especially when you engage in social, where things break within seconds. You need to be very pushy, and you need to have those expectations that things will happen quickly if you do things right. But at the same time, we need to have a much more long-term mindset. We're talking today about the game of influence relations. I think increasingly we're going to talk about the long game, the long-term game about influence relations. Because if you meet a think tank, an academic, or someone else, you're not going to see a piece of coverage the next day. You're not going to see a tweet the next day necessarily that you might have expected in other words. You might see a far greater result in a few months' time. Now, I'll give you another example. We worked with an organization who wanted to do a national competition around a topic to find a certain person. Now, to evaluate and to judge all the entries around the competition, they wanted to have a pool of influential judges. Now, because we'd established a relationship with an academic at a prestigious university in London, we then managed to get that academic to be part of that judging pool. That's not a piece of coverage, it's not a tweet, it's nothing, but it's incredibly powerful for this organization. Who could say that we're running a national competition on this, and by the way, part of that judging panel is this prestigious academic from a high-profile university in London, which is known worldwide. So we have to start measuring things slightly differently. We have to start evaluating meetings and appreciate that some outcomes are going to take a bit longer than maybe we're comfortable with. But that's the new world of influence relations, is the short-term mindset combined with a long-term mindset. Having that dual mindset and approach, I think, is the way that things are going to go forward. And I think I'm going to leave it there, to tell the truth, because I think there's a lot of things that you can ask on behind of that. I think there's a lot of things that you might think about. You might agree, you might disagree. But if I've made you either agree or disagree, I've succeeded. And I think that we have to really start thinking differently about ourselves, organizations, how we relate to people, and how people perceive us, and how we find those people who are going to eventually make the difference to us. Now, doing things differently is hard, but actually thinking differently is much harder. And that's, I think, what's going to set the scene for the foreseeable future. On that note, thank you.